The heat out here is a physical weight. It pushes down on your shoulders, heavier than the plate carrier, heavier than the ruck. 110 degrees in the shade, and there hasn't been any shade for 6 miles. Just hardpan, alkali dust, and the shimmering distortion of heat waves dancing off the valley floor. My name represents a ghost. A memory of a world that burned down 3 years ago. If you're listening to this log, you're either a scavenger like me, or you're one of the lucky ones bunkered down deep, waiting for the radiation to clear and the infected to rot away. Good luck with that. The things I've seen out here, they don't rot. They evolve. I'm currently 3 days' march from the old Highway 95 corridor, deep in the Nevada exclusion zone. The maps from before, the ones we used to trust, are useless here. According to the USGS topos, I'm standing in the middle of a dry lake bed with nothing but scrub brush and scorpions. But my eyes are telling me a different story. And my Geiger counter is clicking a slow, rhythmic warning that makes the hair on my arms stand up despite the heat. I found it by accident. I was tracking a wandering herd of shamblers, maybe 40 heads, mostly desiccated, moving with that mindless, hive-mind momentum toward the west. I was keeping my distance, using the terrain, staying downwind. They led me to a ridge line I hadn't planned on crossing. And that's when I saw the glint. Not nature's reflection. This was geometric. Artificial. I'm looking at a facility that officially doesn't exist. It's nestled into the base of a limestone cliff, half buried by rock slides that look intentional. The fencing is high gauge, topped with razor wire that hasn't rusted as much as it should have. There are warning signs, but the sun has bleached the red paint into a pale, ghostly pink. I can just make out the letters, NASA. But below that, stenciled in black spray paint that looks much fresher, is a designation I've only heard in rumors whispered over ham radio frequencies before the grid went down completely. Protocol Black. I've set up a temporary hide in a ravine about 400 meters out. I need to hydrate. My water bladders are running low, and if this place is dry, I'm dead. But if this is what I think it is, a black site research station operational during the onset of the SHTF scenario, then there might be supplies. MREs, medical caches, maybe even ammo. Or answers. I'm going in at dusk. The shamblers have moved on, drawn by something further down the valley. The silence here is oppressive. It's not the quiet of peace. It's the quiet of a graveyard. Time skip, 1900 hours. The sun is dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and blood oranges. Visibility is dropping. I've engaged my night vision, an old PVS-14 monocular I pulled off a dead National Guardsman outside Vegas. The green phosphor grain makes the desert look like the surface of an alien moon. I breached the perimeter fence 10 minutes ago. Bolt cutters made short work of the chain link. No alarms. No automated turrets. Just the wind whistling through the gaps. I'm moving toward the main airlock now. My boots, Salomon Quests, worn smooth on the soles, crunch softly on the gravel. I'm trying to keep a low profile, weapon raised. I'm running an 18 Malawin Quatches build, suppressed. If there's anything inside, I don't want to ring the dinner bell. The main door is a blast shield, massive and reinforced. It's sealed tight. But the keypad next to it is dead. No power. That means the magnetic locks on the service entrance might be disengaged. I loop around the side, near the ventilation stacks. The air smells different here. Stale. Metallic. Like copper and ozone. Found the service door. It's a heavy steel slab, slightly ajar. Someone left in a hurry. Or someone forced their way in. I check my corners. Clear. I squeeze through the gap, the metal scraping against my tactical vest. Inside, the temperature drops 20 degrees instantly. It's pitch black. I switch on my weapon light, keeping the beam focus low. The floor is tiled, pristine white under the dust. But there are drag marks. Dark streaks that smear across the linoleum, leading deeper into the complex. Dried blood. A lot of it. I'm in a decontamination vestibule. Hazmat suits hang in lockers, empty, like shed skins. I check the pockets. Nothing. I move to the inner door. It pushes open with a groan of rusted hinges that sounds like a scream in the silence. The hallway beyond is a labyrinth of shadows. This isn't just a lab, it's a fortress. Concrete walls, thick glass doors. I pass offices with shattered glass walls. Papers are scattered everywhere. I pick one up. It's a frantic scrawl. Timestamp 3 years ago. Subject 89 breach containment. The viral strain is airborne within the ventilation. God help us. Protocol Black is in effect. Sealed the exits. Protocol Black. The kill switch. The order to burn it all down to contain the infection. But they didn't burn this place. They just left it. Why? I hear a sound. Deep in the facility. A rhythmic thumping. Like a heartbeat, or a machine trying to restart. I freeze, holding my breath. My heart hammers against my ribs. In a survival situation, curiosity kills more often than starvation. But I need to know. I need to know if the origin of the hell we're living in started right here, in this buried tomb beneath the Nevada dust. I push forward, stepping over a barricade of overturned desks. There's a body here. Wearing a lab coat. The skull is wrong. Elongated. Splintered from the inside out. I've seen infected, but I've never seen skeletal mutation like this. This is ground zero stuff. I reach the central hub. A massive atrium with viewing glass looking down into a subterranean hangar. I shine my light through the grime on the glass. My God! Down there, in the dark, suspended in a tank of murky, green fluid, is something massive. It's not human. It never was. And the glass of the tank, it's cracked. I'm not alone here. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door sealing behind me severed the last tether to the Nevada desert. The blinding white heat of the surface was instantly replaced by a subterranean chill that bit through my thermal layers, settling into the marrow of my bones. I stood in the decontamination airlock of Sector 4, the silence so absolute it felt like pressure against my eardrums. My heart rate monitor, displayed in the peripheral HUD of my ocular implant, ticked up a notch, 82 BPM. controlled, steady. But the adrenaline was there, a cold drip in my veins. I initiated a gear check, a ritual to ground myself before pushing into the unknown. Primary weapon, 416 Hong Kong dollars, suppressed, loaded with high-velocity armor-piercing rounds. Chamber check. Brass gleamed in the low light of the emergency LEDs. Secondary, SIG P320 on the hip. Flash bangs and frag grenades secured on the plate carrier. Geiger counter, clicking rhythmically, hovering just below the threshold of concern. But it was the rebreather that worried me. The air quality sensors were flashing amber. Oxygen levels were viable, but the particulate scanner was picking up high concentrations of an unknown biological aerosol. I tightened the mask seals, ensuring the hiss of the filtration system was the only sound I made. Protocol Black, I whispered to myself, the words muffled by the mask. The dossier I'd intercepted from the encrypted NASA relay had been fragmented, redacted to hell and back. It spoke of non-terrestrial biological deviations and spatial folding, but Protocol Black was the kill switch. It wasn't a containment procedure, it was an erasure method. And I was standing inside the eraser. I swept the beam of my weapon-mounted light across the interior blast door. The heavy steel was scarred. Deep gouges, tearing through 3 inches of reinforced alloy, ran diagonally from the ceiling to the floor. They looked like claw marks, but the scale was impossible. Nothing on Earth had the leverage or the structural density to shear through military-grade blast plating like it was wet cardboard. I stepped closer, running a gloved finger near, but not touching, the jagged edge of the metal. There was a residue there, a viscous black substance that seemed to absorb the light from my torch rather than reflect it. Vantablack slime. My stomach tightened. I moved out of the airlock and into the receiving atrium. It was a cavernous space, dominated by a dead security kiosk and rows of overturned waiting chairs. Papers were scattered everywhere, frozen in the chaos of a hasty evacuation. I kept my weapon shouldered, moving with the fluid, rolling gait of a Tier 1 operator, checking corners, slicing the pie. The dust here was thick, undisturbed for decades, except for a single drag mark leading toward the elevators. A blood trail, dried to a rust-brown flake, accompanied it. Approaching the security kiosk, I jacked my portable decryption deck into the hardline port. The terminal was dead, but the facility had residual power running on a backup geothermal loop. The screen flickered to life, bathing the dusty desk in a harsh green glow. I bypassed the standard encryption with a brute force algorithm I'd written for the agency. Access granted? I pulled up the security logs from the date of the lockdown, October 14, 1998. The video file was corrupted, artifacts tearing across the screen, but the audio remained. It was a cacophony of alarms and screaming, not panic screaming, but the guttural, wet sounds of people in agony. A voice cut through the noise, calm, detached. "This is Dr. Eris Thorne. Event horizon confirmed in Subject 8. The barrier has dissolved. Initiating Protocol Black. Seal the lower levels. Flooding B-Wing with neurotoxin. God forgive us." The audio cut out. I pulled the drive. Subject 8. That was new. The dossier had mentioned 7 recovered samples. A sound snapped my attention back to the physical world. A metallic clank, echoing from the ventilation grid high above the atrium. I killed my flashlight instantly, plunging the room into darkness. I flipped my NVGs down. The world turned into a grainy green phosphor landscape. I scanned the ceiling. The ventilation ducts here were industrial size, big enough for a man, or something larger, to crawl through. There. Heat signature. My thermal overlay picked up a bloom of red against the cold blue of the ductwork. It wasn't human. The heat distribution was wrong, no central mass, just a distributed network of heat veins, shifting and flowing like liquid mercury. It was moving fast, scuttling directly over my position. I held my breath, training the muzzle of the 416 on the vent grate. The grate rattled, a screw shearing off and pinging against the tile floor below. The noise was deafening in the silence. The heat signature paused. It knew I was here. I didn't know how, but I felt the weight of its attention. Then, slowly, it moved on, sliding deeper into the facility toward the reactor core. I exhaled, realizing my heart rate had spiked to 140. Whatever that was, I wasn't equipped to fight it in an open atrium. I needed to get to the server room on level 3. The elevators were death traps, coffins waiting to plummet, so I located the emergency stairwell. The door was jammed. I wedged a crowbar into the seam and leveraged it open with a groan of protesting metal. The air that rushed out from the stairwell smelled of ozone and copper. The smell of high-voltage discharge and blood. Descending the stairs, the atmosphere grew heavier. My Geiger counter began to tick faster, the radiation background climbing. The walls of the stairwell were covered in graffiti, but it wasn't gang tags. It was mathematical equations. Frantic, scribbled in marker, in paint, in blood. Calculations regarding dimensional tear thresholds. Someone had spent their last hours trying to solve a problem that had already killed them. On the landing of level 2, I found the first body. It was a soldier, wearing the tattered remains of a hazardous environment combat suit. The patch on the shoulder read OSD, Office of Special Defense. He was sitting against the wall, his skull fused to the concrete behind him. Not smashed into it, asterisk fused star. The bone and the cement had merged at a molecular level. His rifle, a prototype I didn't recognize, was melted into his chest plate. I knelt to inspect his tactical vest. The magazines were empty. He'd gone down fighting. I checked his pockets and found a laminated keycard and a crumpled photo of a family. I pocketed the keycard. It was a level 5 clearance pass. Exactly what I needed to bypass the biometric locks on the server room. As I stood up, the lights in the stairwell surged. The emergency red strobes began to flash, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and grasp at my boots. A low-frequency hum began to vibrate through the floor, shaking dust from the ceiling. The facility was waking up. Protocol Black wasn't just a shutdown, it was a cycle. And I had just triggered the next rotation. My earpiece crackled with static. A voice, distorted and ghostly, whispered through the interference. "Don't let it see you." I tapped the comms. Identify. Static. Then clearer. Get out of the stairwell. It hunts in the vertical shafts. I didn't wait for a second warning. I kicked open the door to level 2. The corridor beyond was bathed in blue ultraviolet light. Decontamination lamps. The sign on the wall read, Xenobiology Labs authorized personnel only. The hallway was lined with observation windows. Most were shattered. Inside the labs, shattered containment tubes littered the floor. But the one at the end of the hall was intact. And it was occupied. Inside the glass, floating in a suspension of amber fluid, was a human torso. But where the head should have been, there was a geometric shape, a shifting, crystalline structure that seemed to defy Euclidean geometry. It pulsed with a dark inner light. As I watched, the crystal rotated, and I felt a sharp, stabbing pain behind my eyes. Cognitive hazard detected. My suit's AI warned, the voice flat and robotic. Injecting neural stabilizers. A hiss at my neck, and the chemical cocktail hit my bloodstream, sharpening my focus and dulling the headache. I tore my eyes away from the thing in the jar. Focus, I growled. The mission is the data. I moved down the corridor, boots silent on the linoleum. The layout of level 2 was a maze of labs and offices. I needed to find the freight elevator override to get to level 3. The blueprints I had memorized showed a security hub halfway down the hall. I reached the hub. The door was unlocked. Inside, a bank of monitors displayed static, except for one. It showed a live feed of the stairwell I had just exited. A shadow was moving on the landing. It was large, humanoid but elongated, limbs stretching too far, joints bending backward. It was sniffing the air where I had been standing seconds ago. It turned its face toward the camera. It didn't have eyes. Just a smooth, black surface where a face should be. It raised a hand and pointed at the camera. The screen went black. It knew where I was. I checked the mag in my 416 Hong Kong dollars again. 30 rounds. 1 in the chamber. I had 2 spare mags and a sidearm. Against the tactical team, I'd like my odds. Against whatever that was? I was running on borrowed time. I grabbed a heavy chair and wedged it under the door handle of the security hub. It wouldn't stop them, but it would buy me seconds. I turned to the console and slotted the dead soldier's keycard. The system chirped. Welcome, Sergeant Miller. Access level 5 confirmed. I navigated to the facility schematics. I needed a route to level 3 that didn't involve the main shafts. There. A maintenance ladder inside the ventilation processing unit. It was tight, claustrophobic, and risky, but it bypassed the main corridors. As I pulled up the map, a file pop-up appeared on the screen. Automated message. If you are reading this, Protocol Black has failed. The breach is total. Do not attempt exfiltration. Suicide is recommended. Not today, I muttered. I heard the crash of the stairwell door being torn off its hinges down the hall. The sound of heavy, wet footsteps slapping against the floor tile followed. They were fast. I smashed the monitor with the butt of my rifle, plunging the room into darkness, and moved to the back of the room where a vent grate sat near the floor. I kicked it in, the metal groaning. I slid into the dust and the dark, pulling the grate back into place just as the door to the security hub buckled under a massive impact. I was in the walls now, and I was heading down. The hiss of the hydraulic seal breaking on the Sector 4 blast door was the loudest sound I had heard in 3 hours. A sharp mnemonic scream that cut through the recycled air of my respirator. I waited, heart hammering against my ribs, watching the dust motes dance in the beam of my tactical light. Nothing rushed me. Nothing screamed back. There was only the stale, pressurized silence of a tomb that had been sealed since 1989. I checked my wrist monitor. Oxygen levels were at 78%. The Geiger counter, clipped to my shoulder strap, was clicking at a steady, rhythmic pace, not alarmingly high. But the background radiation here was triple what it had been in the lobby. I adjusted the grip on the pry bar, my knuckles white inside the heavy rubber gloves, and stepped through the threshold. Sector 4 was labeled biological containment on the faded blueprints I'd recovered from the security desk, but the hallway didn't look like a lab. It looked like a war zone. The emergency lighting strips were flickering with a dying, strobe light cadence, painting the corridor in flashes of deep red and pitch black. Scorch marks marred the walls, starburst patterns of soot that indicated small arms fire. Someone had fought a running battle here. I knelt by a blackened smear on the floor, bringing the light close. Spent casings. 56 millimeters, military grade. This wasn't a lab accident, this was a purge. I moved forward, utilizing a low-profile shuffle, keeping my center of gravity down. Every sound I made, the crunch of broken glass, the squeak of rubber saws, felt like a beacon. The air was colder here, biting through the thermal layers of my suit. The temperature drop was unnatural, a physical weight pressing against the polycarbonate visor of my helmet. I reached a junction. To the left, cryo storage. To the right, observation deck B. I chose the right path, hoping for a terminal or a vantage point. The floor began to slope downward, and the radiation counter's clicking accelerated, a frantic Geiger jazz that made my teeth ache. I paused to calibrate the dosimeter. 450 millisieverts per hour. Not immediately lethal, but I couldn't camp here. I had to move. I reached the observation deck door. It was fused shut, the metal warped as if subjected to extreme heat. I deployed the hydraulic spreader from my pack, the heavy tool whining as it forced the warped titanium apart. With a groan of yielding metal, the door popped. I squeezed through. Inside, the observation glass overlooking the test chamber was shattered. Shards the size of guillotines littered the floor. I ignored them, sweeping my light over the console banks. Most were dead, but one terminal in the corner blinked with a rhythmic, green cursor. I approached it, wiping away a thick layer of gray dust. It wasn't dust. It was ash. I suppressed the shutter and keyed the input. No password required. The system was in a diagnostic loop. I pulled up the last access logs. The date was October 14, 1989. The user ID was Director Vance. I opened the file labeled Protocol Black Executive Summary. The text scrolled across the CRT monitor, the green glow reflecting in my visor. Subject: Containment failure Asset 9. Status: Critical. Action: Protocol Black initiated. Summary: Asset 9 has breached the Faraday cage in Sector 5. Conventional ballistics are ineffective due to the asset's ability to manipulate local electromagnetic fields. Casualties are at 94%. Dr. Ayres claims the asset is attempting to communicate via the facility's power grid. This hypothesis is rejected. The asset is hostile. It is feeding. Directives: 1. Seal sectors 1 through 4. 2. Vent atmosphere and sublevels to absolute vacuum. 3. If containment is not re-established by 0600 hours, initiate on-site nuclear sterilization. Device: -4 Malawin Quach's tactical yield. I froze. Nuclear sterilization. I was standing on top of a bomb. I frantically scrolled down. The log ended with an error message: detonation failure. Mechanism jammed. Seismic activity detected in Silo A. The bomb hadn't gone off. It was still down there, likely unstable, sitting next to whatever Asset 9 was. That's when I heard it. A sound that shouldn't exist in a dead facility. It came from the vent directly above the shattered observation window. It sounded like wet leather sliding over steel, accompanied by a chittering, static-like interference that buzzed in my headset. I killed my flashlight instantly. Darkness slammed into the room, absolute and suffocating. I held my breath, my hand drifting to the flare gun on my belt, my only real weapon against something biological. The sliding noise stopped. Then, a heavy thud on the floor amidst the glass. It was in the room with me. I activated the thermal overlay on my visor, praying the batteries held. The room washed into grainy blues and purples. In the center of the room, near the shattered window, a heat signature bloomed. It wasn't human. It was too elongated, the limbs possessing too many joints. It crouched on 4 legs, its head twitching in rapid, bird-like movements. The heat signature was erratic, pulsing from bright white to cold blue, as if its internal temperature was fluctuating wildly. This was Asset 9, or its offspring. My heart rate monitor spiked to 140. If I moved, the noise would give me away. If I stayed, it would smell me or sense the electronics in my suit. I needed a distraction. Slowly, agonizingly, I reached into my dump pouch and retrieved a chemical light stick. I didn't crack it yet. I waited until the creature turned its head away, scanning the console I had just used. With a flick of my wrist, I tossed the unlit stick toward the open door I had forced ajar. It hit the metal frame with a hollow clack. The creature moved with terrifying speed, a blur of motion that the thermal camera could barely track. It shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and lunged toward the door. I didn't watch it go. I vaulted over the console, sprinting toward the service hatch on the far wall labeled maintenance shaft, lower levels. I hit the release valve, spinning the wheel with adrenaline-fueled strength. The hatch groaned open. I dove inside just as a high-pitched, oscillating frequency screamed through the room behind me, shattering the remaining glass and the console screens. I slammed the hatch shut and spun the locking wheel, collapsing against the cold metal rungs of the ladder. I was safe, for the moment. But I wasn't going up. The hatch only led down. Down toward the reactor. Down toward the failed nuke. Down toward the nest. I checked my Geiger counter again. 600 millisieverts. Rising. I keyed my voice recorder, my voice shaking. Chapter 3. Protocol Black was a failure. The nuke is active. The asset is loose. And I think it just herded me exactly where it wants me to go. I looked down into the abyss of the shaft. The darkness seemed to be moving. The air in Sector 4 tasted like copper and stale ozone, a metallic tang that coated the back of my throat with every shallow breath. I adjusted the strap of the respirator I'd scavenged from the decontamination airlock, tightening the seal against the bridge of my nose. My heart rate was a steady drum against my ribs, forced into a rhythm of artificial calm. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. Panic burned oxygen and dulled reflexes. And down here, 20 stories beneath the Nevada crust, a dull reflex was a death sentence. I checked the Glock 17 again. It was a pointless, repetitive tick, but the weight of the polymer frame in my hand was the only grounding reality in this nightmare. I had 11 rounds left in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. 12 chances to stop whatever was hunting me, or 1 chance to end it on my own terms. I kept the weapon at a low ready, elbows tucked, moving through the corridor with a rolling gait to minimize the sound of my boots on the gritted concrete. The emergency lighting had failed in this wing, leaving only the intermittent, strobing flash of red warning beacons to cut through the suffocating darkness. Every shadow seemed to stretch and contort in the crimson pulses. I reached an intersection, the walls emblazoned with fading yellow stencils, biological containment to the left, tactical operations / server farm to the right. My objective was the servers. I needed to know what Protocol Black actually was before the facility's automated systems buried me alive. I approached the right-hand corridor, hugging the wall. I paused at the corner, slicing the pie slowly. My tactical light was off. Light discipline was critical. If the things I'd heard skittering in the ventilation shafts, relied on sight, a beam of light would be a dinner bell. I listened. The silence of the lab was deceptive. Underneath the hum of the failing HVAC systems, there was a wet, rhythmic sound, like raw meat being slapped against tile. It was distant, coming from the biowing, but it was enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. Clear. I moved fast, crossing the open threshold of the corridor, the fatal funnel, and pressing into the next section. The floor here was littered with debris, shattered tablets, overturned gurneys, and the calcified remains of what looked like heavy assault armor. I stepped over a breastplate stamped with the NASA logo, but the Kevlar was shredded, torn inward as if something had breached it with the ease of a can opener. I didn't look for the body. There was no time to process the gore. The door to the server farm was a heavy blast shutter, currently sealed. The keypad next to it was dead, the liquid crystal display cracked. I holstered the Glock and pulled the pry bar from my belt. It was crude, noisy, and dangerous, but I had no other entry vector. I jammed the tip into the seal between the doors and leaned my weight into it. Metal groaned, a high-pitched shriek that sounded deafening in the quiet. I froze, waiting for a reaction from the dark. Nothing but the red strobe. I gritted my teeth and heaved. The hydraulics whined and gave way, the door sliding open just enough for me to slip through sideways. Inside, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. The server room was a mausoleum of blue LEDs, and the roar of high-velocity cooling fans. Rows of black monoliths stretched into the dark, housing the petabytes of data this facility had churned out before it went dark. I moved to the central terminal, a hardened console isolated on a raised platform. It was still powered. I holstered the weapon and began typing. My fingers felt clumsy, thick with adrenaline. I bypassed the initial biometric lock using the erratic keycard I'd taken from DR. Eris Thorne's corpse in Chapter 2. The screen flashed amber. Asterisk access granted. Level 5 clearance. Asterisk. I navigated the directory with frantic speed. Asterisk Project Sidewinder. Xenobiological morphology. Containment_breach_log. TXT. Asterisk I ignored them all, searching specifically for the command syntax. I typed, asterisk query, protocol black. Asterisk. The screen hesitated, the cursor blinking like a mocking eye. Then, text began to scroll, faster than I could read, until it settled on a summary window. Protocol black / status. Active / T-00:48:00. Authorization, Department of Defense / Special Access Program. Asterisk directive asterisk. Asterisk 1. Total asset denial. Thermobaric sterilization of sectors 1 through 10. Asterisk. Asterisk 2. Seal all surface exits via shaped charges. Completed asterisk. Asterisk 3. Initiate sleeper countermeasures to hunt biological contaminants and unauthorized personnel. Asterisk. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a rescue signal. Protocol Black was a purge. They weren't sending Marines to pull us out. They were turning the facility into a kiln to burn the evidence. The sleeper countermeasures explained the mechanical sounds I'd heard in the walls, automated kill drones or something worse. Activated to mop up survivors before the bombs went off. I scrolled down to the addendum. Asterisk priority target, subject 9, designation, the Mimic. Asterisk. Asterisk secondary target, all witnesses. Asterisk. All witnesses, I whispered, the words vanishing into the drone of the fans. I was the secondary target. The things hunting me weren't just the alien escapees. The building itself was trying to kill me. I needed a map of the shaped charges. If I could find a weak point in the detonation grid, maybe I could blow a hole out instead of being blown in. I pulled up the schematics for the surface exits. The north airlock was fused. The cargo elevator shaft was rigged with C4. But the ventilation exhaust. A proximity alarm blared on the console, a sharp, dissonant ping that nearly made me jump out of my skin. I looked at the security grid on the monitor. Asterisk motion detected, Sector 4 corridor. Multiple contacts. Asterisk. The red dots on the screen were moving fast. Too fast for humans. They were swarming the hallway I had just left. The mimics. They must have heard the pry bar. I watched the dots converge on the blast door I had forced open. They were stacking up, testing the gap. Then, a new signal appeared on the screen. A blue dot. It was located in the maintenance subtunnels, 3 levels below me. The tag read, *Asset K. Vance, Chief Security Officer, vital signs, critical. Asterisk. Someone was alive. Vance. The guy whose name was on the locker where I found the ammo. If he was security, he might have the override codes for the thermobaric charges. But he was 3 floors down, in the dark, surrounded by things that wanted to wear our skin. I had a choice: stay here and try to hack a heavy encryption with 40 minutes left on the clock, or descend into the gut of the lab to find a dying man who might have the keys to the kingdom. A loud thud echoed from the blast door entrance. Metal shrieked. A long, spindly limb, composed of something that looked like obsidian and wet muscle, hooked around the edge of the door I'd pried open. It began to pull. The hydraulics screamed in protest. I grabbed the heavy mag light and the Glock, racking the slide to ensure the round was seated, even though I knew it was. I looked at the ventilation grate above the server racks. It was narrow, tight, and led straight down to the maintenance tunnels. Protocol Black, I muttered, gauging the jump to the top of the server rack. Let's see if you can kill me before I kill this place. The blast door groaned, the gap widening as the nightmare squeezed its way inside. I didn't wait to see the face of the thing. I scrambled up the rack, kicked the grate loose, and pulled myself into the claustrophobic darkness of the vents just as the sound of tearing metal erupted below. The hunt was on, and the clock was ticking. The silence in sub-level 5 wasn't empty, it was heavy, pressing against my eardrums with a physical weight that made every shallow breath sound like a hurricane. The air here tasted different than the upper levels, less like dust and rot, and more like ozone and sterilized copper. I adjusted the strap of my respirator, the rubber digging into the sweat-slick skin of my jaw, and checked the readouts on the Geiger counter strapped to my wrist. The needle was dancing just below the red zone, a constant, jittery warning that I was walking into the belly of a reactor, or something far worse. My grip tightened on the Mk-18. I had 3 magazines left. 90 rounds of 5.56mm green tip between me and whatever had turned the previous security team into paste on the walls of the elevator shaft. I moved using the bounding Overwatch technique, despite being alone, slicing the pie at every corner before committing my body to the hallway. Muscle memory from deployments I thought I'd left behind took over, suppressing the lizard brain urge to sprint blindly for an exit. The blueprint I'd pulled from the reception terminal 2 hours ago, and 4 floors up, indicated that the primary server farm was dead ahead. If I wanted to understand Protocol Black, the answers were locked in those hard drives. But the blueprint hadn't mentioned the organic growth. That's what it looked like anyway. Thick, black tendrils, like hardened resin or vascular cabling, ran along the ceiling pipes, pulsing faintly with a bioluminescent violet rhythm. It wasn't mold. It looked architectural, engineered. A sound stopped me cold. A wet, rhythmic clicking, like bones striking ceramic. It was coming from the ventilation grid above. I froze, sinking into the shadows of a recessed doorway, killing the lumen on my weapon light. Darkness swallowed the corridor, absolute and suffocating. I flipped down my NVGs. The world turned into a grain-heavy phosphor green. Through the monocular, the heat signatures of the black veins on the ceiling glowed white-hot. And there, clinging to the overhead conduits 10 meters ahead, was a shape that defied anatomical logic. It was humanoid, but elongated, limbs stretched like taffy and reinforced with exoskeletal plating that shimmered under the IR illuminator. It wasn't wearing armor. The armor was part of it. Fused. Protocol Black wasn't a contagion. It was an integration. The thing turned its head, a sleek, eyeless visor of smooth bone, and scanned the corridor. It was hunting. Not with eyes, but with sensors. I held my breath, lowering my heart rate through sheer force of will, praying my thermal signature was masked enough by the thick canvas of my jacket. The entity paused, a low, synthesized growl vibrating from its throat, before skittering further down the hall with terrifying speed, disappearing into a maintenance hatch. I waited a full 2 minutes before moving. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump. I forced myself to check the chamber of the rifle. Brass. Good. I moved forward, low and fast, stepping over a barricade of overturned heavy-duty lockers. Behind them lay what remained of a darker tactical team, black gear, no insignias. Mercenaries, maybe? Or a clean-up crew that got cleaned up. I checked their rig. Their weapons were gone, stripped clean. But one of them had a ruggedized tablet clutch and a rigor mortis death grip. I pried it loose, wiping the grime from the cracked screen. It had enough charge to flicker to life. Access level, Omega. File, Protocol Black Phase 3 deployment. I tapped the log entry. The audio file crackled, the voice distorted by panic and gunfire. This is Captain Vance. Sector 5 is compromised. The subjects have breached containment. They're coordinating. They cut the power to the thermal grids. They can see us through the walls. Command, request immediate. The audio cut to a wet tearing sound and static. I pocketed the tablet. Coordinating. The word bounced around my skull. The thing on the ceiling hadn't just been patrolling, it was scouting. I was being herded. I reached the blast doors of the server farm. The mag lock was fried, sparks showering onto the linoleum. I used the pry bar from my pack, wedging it into the seam. With a groan of rusted hydraulics and straining muscle, I forced the doors open just enough to slip through. Inside, the room was a cavern of humming monoliths. Rows of server racks stretched into the darkness, bathed in the strobe light effect of failing emergency LEDs. The temperature dropped 20 degrees instantly. I made my way to the central terminal, a raised dais overlooking the rows of data towers. My boots squeaked on the glass floor, a sound that seemed deafening. I jacked the tablet into the terminal via a USB-C cable I kept in my admin pouch. The encryption was heavy, military grade, but the tablet acted as a skeleton key. The screens flared to life, cascading streams of data reflecting in my goggles. Project Ares, I read aloud, my voice rasping. Atmospheric resonance and entity synthesis. Protocol Black wasn't about creating super soldiers. It was about creating hosts. The data logs detailed signal transmissions received from deep space, originating from a localized tear in the ionosphere above the Nevada desert. NASA hadn't built this lab to study the desert, they built it to catch a signal. And the signal carried a code. DNA code. A proximity alarm on my watch beeped. Soft, single tone. Motion detected. Close. I spun around, raising the rifle. The server room was a maze of shadows. The motion tracker on my wrist pinged again. Distance, 15 meters. Behind me? No, below me. I looked down at the glass floor. Beneath the reinforced transparency, in the crawl space meant for cabling, a face was looking up at me. It was pale, human, but the eyes were gone, replaced by optical lenses drilled directly into the skull. It smiled, revealing rows of serrated metallic teeth. Breach! I screamed internally, diving to the left just as the glass exploded upward. Shards of reinforced laminate shredded the air. I rolled behind a server bank, shoulder checking the metal casing. The creature erupted from the floor, landing in a crouch on the dais. It was wearing the tattered remains of a NASA lab coat, fused with the same black exoskeletal plating I'd seen earlier. It raised a hand, and I saw the barrel of a weapon integrated into its forearm. It fired, not bullets, but a concentrated pulse of kinetic energy. The server rack I was hiding behind buckled, sparks showering my neck. I leaned out, switching to semi-auto, and double-tapped the center of mass. The round sparked off its chest plate. No penetration. Armor piercing needed. I dropped the mag and slapped in one of my 2 remaining mags loaded with M855A1 steel penetrators. I needed a headshot. The creature vaulted over the server rack, moving with unnatural fluidity. I scrambled back, firing from the hip to suppress it. One round caught it in the shoulder, spinning it around. It shrieked, a sound like dial-up internet mixed with a human scream. I didn't wait. I broke cover, sprinting for the Halon fire suppression manual override on the far wall. The creature recovered instantly, sprinting along the tops of the server racks, leaping gap to gap like a spider. I could hear the heavy thud of its landing getting closer. I reached the panel, slamming my fist into the emergency purge button. Klaxons blared. Halon release in 3, 2. I ripped the respirator mask tighter against my face, checking the seal. The creature leaped, mid-air, claws extended. 1. A hiss like a jet engine filled the room. Thick, white gas exploded from the ceiling nozzles. The Halon system was designed to starve a fire of oxygen. It would starve anything organic, too. The gas hit the creature mid-jump, the sheer pressure knocking it off course. It crashed into a rack of hard drives, thrashing as the oxygen was sucked from the room. I dropped to the floor, prone, where the oxygen concentration would linger longest before the gas settled. The creature was choking, clutching at its throat, the human parts of its physiology betraying the alien upgrades. It wasn't fully converted. It still needed to breathe. I took the shot. Through the swirling white fog, I lined up the illuminated reticle of my optic with the creature's visor. I exhaled, squeezing the trigger. The rifle kicked. A spray of black fluid painted the white server chassis. The creature slumped, twitching, then went still. I lay there for a moment, gasping into my mask, watching the oxygen levels on my wrist display plummet. I had to move. The gas was effective, but it was a double-edged sword. I scrambled to my feet, crouching low, and grabbed the tablet from the dais on my way out. As I stumbled back into the corridor, sealing the blast door behind me to contain the gas, the tablet vibrated with a new notification. I looked down. It wasn't a log file. It was a live chat message, incoming from a terminal on sublevel 8. Unknown user, * you are efficient. Protocol Black requires strong stock. Come deeper. We are waiting. *. I stared at the screen, the blood draining from my face. They weren't just coordinating. They were recruiting. I looked at the elevator shaft at the end of the hall. The cables were cut, but the emergency ladder was intact. Sublevel 8. The bottom. I reloaded my weapon, checked the chamber, and began the descent. The silence in sublevel 5 wasn't empty. It was pressurized. It pressed against my eardrums with the weight of 2 miles of Nevada bedrock and something else, something that hummed just below the threshold of human hearing, vibrating in the fillings of my teeth. I checked the scavenged MP5 for the 3rd time in as many minutes. The magazine was light, too light. 17 rounds of 9mm ball ammunition remained. Against the heavily armored private military contractors I'd evaded in the upper levels, it would have been sufficient. Against the things that Protocol Black had birthed down here, it felt like holding a pea shooter against a hurricane. My tactical light was dying. The beam flickered, turning the sleek, sterile white of the corridor into a strobelit nightmare of shifting shadows. I killed the light, opting to rely on the ambient emergency red that pulsed rhythmically from the wall sconces. Red light preserved night vision, but down here, it made the blood trails look like oil. I moved with practiced fluidity, rolling my feet heel to toe to dampen the sound of my boots on the metal grating. Every sound was a betrayal. The creature, if you could even call it that, hunted by vibration. I had learned that in the server room. Watching on the security feed as it dismantled the sentry turret with the casual indifference of a child pulling wings off a fly. I reached the intersection of Sector 4 and the primary cooling loop. The signage here was different. No longer the friendly NASA blue and white. Everything was stark black and yellow hazard warnings. Protocol Black restricted area, Class 6 hazard. I pressed my back against the cold bulkhead, sliding down to a crouch to slice the corner. The hallway ahead was obstructed by debris, overturned lab tables, shattered glass, and the twisted wreckage of a containment drone. I needed to get to the primary data hub. The partial log I'd pulled from the dead scientist's tablet upstairs mentioned a failsafe, a way to reseal the breach. If I didn't find it, the quarantine lockout would vent the entire facility into the vacuum of the testing chamber in less than an hour. I moved into the debris field, the smell of ozone and copper hitting me hard. It smelled like a lightning strike mixed with an abattoir. My boot crunched on a shard of reinforced glass, and I froze. The hum in the air spiked, a sharp dissonance that made my vision blur. It was close. I controlled my breathing, forcing my heart rate down. Panic consumes oxygen. Panic makes you loud. I scanned the ceiling. The thing moved through the heavy infrastructure, the cable runs and ventilation shafts. Above me, a vent grate hung loose by a single screw. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. The hum subsided. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and crept forward, stepping over the corpse of a security officer. His rig was shredded, the ceramic plates of his body armor sheared through as if by a laser, but the edges were jagged, organic. I reached down, my fingers brushing his belt, and unclipped a flashbang grenade. It was a desperate tool, but desperation was the only currency I had left. I reached the heavy blast doors of the data hub. They were sealed, the mag locks engaged. I pulled the bypass tool I jury-rigged from a maintenance data pad and jacked it into the wall port. The screen flickered, code scrolling in a waterfall of green. Encryption level, Omega. It would take time. Time I didn't have. I watched the progress bar crawl, 12%, 15%, while keeping my weapon trained on the dark maw of the hallway behind me. That was when the shadows detached themselves from the wall. It wasn't instant. It was a slow, oily separation, as if the darkness had gained viscosity. The entity didn't have a fixed shape. It was a roiling mass of vantablack geometry, limbs forming and dissolving in a constant, glitching cycle. It stood 7 feet tall, then 4, then 10, defying conservation of mass. It had no eyes, but I felt the weight of its attention physically, like a change in air pressure. "Come on," I whispered, the sweat stinging my eyes. The datapad beeped. 88%. The creature let out a sound, a digital shriek, like a modem screaming in pain, and lunged. It didn't run, it flickered forward, closing 30 feet in a blink. I didn't think. Training took over. I ripped the pin from the flashbang and rolled it across the floor, squeezing my eyes shut and clamping my hands over my ears. The detonation was a physical blow, a concussive wave that rattled my teeth. Even through my eyelids, the flash was blinding. I heard the creature scream, a sound that shifted from a roar to a high-pitched whine. I snapped my eyes open, raising the MP5. The creature was reeling, its form destabilizing, turning into static. I squeezed the trigger. Controlled bursts. Pop, pop, pop. The 9mm round sparked off its hide, but where the flash bang had disrupted its cohesion, the bullets bit deep, spraying a neon blue fluid that hissed where it touched the floor. It wasn't killing it, but it was hurting it. The creature lashed out, a whip-thin tendril of shadow slashing across the room. It caught the data pad, shattering it. The door hissed. The lock disengaged. I didn't wait to see if the creature recovered. I shoulder-checked the heavy steel door, stumbling into the server room, and slammed the manual override. The maglock thudded home just as a heavy impact dented the steel from the outside. Once. Twice. Then silence. I slumped against the door, checking my ammo. 7 rounds left. I was trapped, but I was in. The room was freezing, kept at sub-zero temperatures for the quantum computing cores. In the center of the room, surrounded by banks of servers, was a single terminal illuminated by a spotlight. I limped toward it, the adrenaline crash making my hands shake. I accessed the main file directory. Project Protocol Black. Subject Non-Baryonic Entity 01. I opened the file, and the mystery that had drawn me into this desert hellscape finally unraveled. The text was clear, terrifyingly clinical. Subject is not biological. Subject is a dimensional anomaly given sentience through localized quantum observation. It feeds on probability. It collapses wave functions to ensure the outcome where it consumes the observer. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just hunting me. By observing it, by acknowledging it, I was feeding it. The tactical movements, the stealth, the fight, it was all just data to the entity. It was learning how I survived to better understand how to end me. I scrolled further. Containment failure, event horizon imminent. There was a timestamp. The facility wasn't just breached, it was sinking. The logs showed the facility's location data. We weren't just underground anymore. The coordinates were shifting, descending not into the Earth, but into elsewhere. A new window popped up. Failsafe activation requires manual input at reactor core. The reactor core. That was in Sector 9. 5 levels down. I looked at the security feed on the main monitor. The hallway outside my door was empty. The creature was gone. But on the feed for the reactor level, I saw them. Not one creature. Hundreds. They were swarming the core, drawn to the energy source like moths to a flame. I looked at the 7 rounds in my magazine. I looked at the crowbar hooked to my belt. I looked at the map. There was a maintenance shaft that bypassed the main elevators, leading directly to the cooling vents of the reactor. It was a suicide run. I saved the data to a drive, encrypted it, and swallowed it. If I died, maybe someone would find the body. Maybe not. I stood up, the pain in my ribs a dull throb. I racked the slide of the MP5, chambering the next round. Okay, I said to the empty, freezing room. Let's see who collapses whose wave function. I turned to the ventilation grate in the corner of the room, kicked it in, and crawled into the darkness, leaving the safety of the light behind. The descent into the hive began. My heart rate monitor was a strobe light in the corner of my vision, pulsing a jagged red line that synced perfectly with the throbbing in my temples. 142 BPM. Too high. Metabolic burn rate was critical. I forced a breath, holding it for 4 seconds, exhaling for 4. Box breathing. It was the only way to keep the tremors in my hands from rattling the barrel of the scavenged Mk18 carbine against the doorframe. The silence in Sector 4 wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressurized, like the air inside a coffin before the lid is nailed shut. I wasn't just in a basement anymore. I was 300 feet below the Nevada hardpan, inside the lung of a beast that had been holding its breath since 1989. I checked the magazine. 7 rounds. I had a half-empty pistol on my hip and a flare gun with a single shell. That was it. That was the sum total of my leverage against whatever Protocol Black had turned the security team into. I moved, rolling my heel to my toe to dampen the sound of my boots on the linoleum, slicing the pie around the corner of the hallway. Clear. But the walls were wrong. The military-grade gray paint was peeling, revealing a sublayer that looked like obsidian glass. It wasn't construction material, it was growth. The facility was calcifying, turning into something brittle and alien. I reached the heavy blast doors marked mainframe/data archival. The biometric pad was fried, sparking intermittently. This was where the answers were. I needed to know why the containment breach alarm was screaming silently on my HUD. Why the Geiger counter was clicking in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. And why the shadows in this place seemed to have a viscosity that light couldn't penetrate. I pulled the maintenance jack from my belt, a heavy, rusted pry bar I'd found near the elevators, and jammed it into the manual override slot. I put my weight into it. The hydraulics groaned, a sound like a dying whale echoing down the corridor. I froze, waiting for a reaction. Nothing but the hum of the air scrubbers. I pushed harder. The doors parted just enough for me to slip through. Inside, the temperature dropped 20 degrees instantly. My breath plumed in the stale air. The server room was a cavern of blinking lights and towering monoliths of black plastic and steel, cooled by liquid nitrogen pipes that hissed softly. In the center of the room, illuminated by the amber glow of a backup terminal, sat a body. It was wearing a lab coat, perfectly preserved by the cold. The name tag read Dr. A. Vance, Director of Theoretical Physics. I approached the terminal, keeping the carbine trained on the shadows between the server racks. I didn't touch the body. I'd learned that lesson in the mess hall. I plugged my data link into the console. The OS was archaic, a command line interface that predated the graphical revolution, but it was functional. I typed, query, Protocol Black. The screen flickered. Text spooled out faster than I could read, green phosphor burning into my retinas. Project Acheron / status. Critical failure. Containment 0%. Subject, the resonance. Entry November 4th, 1989. We were wrong. It is not biological. It is not viral. We treated the symptoms, the hemorrhaging, the aggression, the calcification of the skin, assuming a pathogen. But pathogens require biology. The entity discovered in the artifact does not infect cells, it infects physics. It is a frequency. A standing wave that rewrites the atomic bonds of carbon-based life to suit a non-Euclidean geometry. It's trying to drag us into its dimension, one atom at a time. I felt the blood drain from my face. The buzzing I'd been hearing in my ears since Chapter 3 wasn't tinnitus. It was them. I scrolled down. Protocol Black initiated. Total facility purge. The nuke buried in the foundation is set to a fail-safe trigger. If the resonance breaches the Faraday shielding of the lower labs, the sight vaporizes. My eyes snap to the bottom of the screen. Shield integrity, 14%. I wasn't just fighting monsters. I was standing on a nuclear landmine that was slowly ticking down as the walls rotted away. I needed to reinforce the shielding, or I needed to get out. But the exit was up, and the shielding controls were down, in the reactor core. A sound tore me from the screen. A wet, tearing noise like canvas ripping, coming from the ceiling directly above me. I dove. I didn't look, I didn't think, I just threw myself to the side, rolling behind a bank of servers just as a mass of black fluid slammed into the spot where I had been standing. The metal floor hissed and smoked. I scrambled to a knee, raising the rifle. The thing uncoiled. It was vaguely humanoid, clad in the tattered remnants of tactical SWAT gear, but inside the armor, there was no man. The limbs were elongated, the joints bending backward with sickening cracks. The head was gone. In its place was a swirling vortex of that obsidian glass, a singularity that seemed to suck the light out of the room. It didn't have eyes, but it turned toward me. The Geiger counter on my belt screamed. Tactical, I whispered to myself, voice shaking. Think tactical. Bullets wouldn't stop a frequency. Kinetic energy was useless against something that rewrote physics. I looked at the nitrogen pipes running along the server rack next to the entity. It was hulking toward me, moving with a glitchy, stuttering motion, like a video buffer skipping frames. I aimed not at the creature, but at the valve stem of the cooling pipe 3 feet above its head. I squeezed the trigger. 3 shots. Asterisk crack crack crack. Asterisk. The brass valve shattered. A jet of liquid nitrogen, cold enough to freeze air solid, erupted downward in a white fog. The entity shrieked, a sound not made of vocal cords, but of metal grinding on bone, as the sub-zero blast hit it. The black fluid comprising its body instantly solidified, turning from a liquid state to brittle, frozen crystal. It froze mid-lunge, a statuesque horror trapped in ice. I didn't wait to see if it would thaw. I sprinted for the rear exit of the server room, my boots slipping on the frost. I slammed through the emergency crash bar and into the stairwell, panting, my lungs burning with the cold air. I leaned against the heavy steel door, jamming the pry bar through the handle to wedge it shut. Safe. For a minute. I checked the map I'd downloaded. The reactor core was 2 levels down. If I could manually reset the Faraday cage from the control room, I could stop the nuke from detonating. If I failed, the fail-deadly switch would erase Nevada from the map. But as I looked down the spiral staircase, into the abyss of the lower levels, I saw the darkness moving. It wasn't just shadows. The darkness was rising, climbing the stairs like rising water. My radio crackled to life, breaking the silence for the first time in hours. It wasn't static. It was a voice. Clear, calm, and terrifyingly human. Subject 11, the voice said, echoing in my earpiece. You are interfering with the harmonization. Please surrender your biomass. We are so very hungry. It was the voice of the pilot who had flown me here. The pilot I had seen die in the crash. I turned off the radio. I checked the flare gun. 1 shot. I holstered the empty carbine and drew the flare gun. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a distraction. I looked at the datapad's shield integrity reading, 13%. Dropping fast. Protocol black, I muttered, stepping onto the metal grating of the stairs. Let's see what you do with fire. I began the descent. The concussive force of the flashbang didn't just ring my ears. It felt like someone had driven a railroad spike through my equilibrium. The world tilted violently to the left. A wash of harsh white light and high-pitched tinnitus drowning out the chaotic reality of sublevel 4. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the polished linoleum slick with a mixture of fire suppression foam and coagulating blood. My breath hitched in my throat, tasting of copper and burned ozone. I wasn't fighting a standard security detail anymore. The team that had breached the freight elevator 5 minutes ago moved with the predatory synchronization of Tier 1 operators. They were silence weaponized. I slammed my shoulder against the doorframe of the server room, raising the 416 Hong Kong dollars I'd scavenged from the first casualty. The holographic sight was shattered, just a jagged frame of glass, so I sighted down the rail. 2 shadows detached themselves from the gloom of the corridor. No shouting. No freeze. Just the rhythmic, suppressed thwip-thwip of rounds tearing into the drywall inches from my face. Dust pulverized into the air, choking me. I didn't fire back. I had 11 rounds left in the magazine, and suppressive fire was a luxury for the living. I needed an equalizer. Sector 4 Alpha clear. A voice crackled over the radio I'd clipped to my vest. It was synthesized, devoid of inflection. Advancing to containment node. Biological markers suggest the target is wounded. Bleed-out rate estimated at 12 minutes. They were tracking my vitals. Smart tech. Maybe thermal residues or a heartbeat sensor. I looked down at my left thigh. The tourniquet I'd rigged from a lab coat sleeve and a screwdriver was holding, but the dark stain on my jeans was expanding. I gritted my teeth, fighting the gray static encroaching on my vision. High-stakes survival wasn't about being faster, it was about being crueler. I scanned the server room. Racks of blinking drives hummed with an ominous energy, cooled by liquid nitrogen pipes running along the floor. I reached for the tactical knife on my belt and dropped to a prone position, crawling toward the coolant intake valve. The footsteps were closer now. Heavy, deliberate thuds. They weren't rushing. They knew I was cornered. I jammed the knife blade into the pressurized joint of the nitrogen line, twisting with every ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength I had left. The metal groaned, then sheared. A geyser of supercooled vapor erupted with a shriek like a banshee. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. The thermal optics of the advancing squad would be useless in this whiteout. A wall of freezing fog blinding their sensors. I heard confused chatter, the first break in their discipline. Visuals compromised. Thermal bloom negative. We're blind. I didn't wait. I rolled away from the expanding cloud, my fingers numb as I gripped the rifle. I fired blindly into the fog at hip level. 3 shots. A wet thud followed, then a scream that was cut short. I scrambled up, staying low, and sprinted for the rear access hatch. As I crashed through the door, I didn't look back at the freezing tomb I'd left behind. The corridor beyond was marked Biohazard, Level 5. The air here was different, stale, recycled, and heavy with a scent that reminded me of electric discharge and rotting orchids. This was the heart of the facility. I needed answers before I died. If Protocol Black was active, that meant complete sterilization. They weren't just here to kill me, they were here to erase this place from the map. I limped toward a hardened glass observation deck overlooking the central atrium. What I saw stopped me cold. The atrium wasn't a lab. It was an excavation site. In the center of the massive chamber, suspended by heavy industrial cables, was a geometric object that defied Euclidean geometry. It was a shifting, obsidian polyhedron, pulsing with a low-frequency rhythm that vibrated in my teeth. But that wasn't the horror. The horror was the pile of bodies at the base of the pit. Scientists. Technicians. Security. Hundreds of them. They hadn't been shot. They were twisted. Their limbs were elongated, their faces stretched into silent screams, fused together like melted wax. I spotted a command terminal next to the window, the amber cursor blinking in the darkness. I practically fell into the chair, my bloody fingers flying over the keyboard. I'd bypassed the encryption using the keycard I'd taken from the director's corpse in Chapter 6. The screen flooded with text. Protocol Black, activate. Authorization, United States Space Force / Department of Energy, redacted. Threat level, existential. I scrolled down, my eyes widening as the text revealed the truth. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't radiation. Asterisk. Subject 82, the artifact, emits a psionic waveform capable of rewriting biological code. Infection is cognitive. Knowledge of the artifact's geometry initiates cellular mutation. Containment impossible once visual contact is made. Protocol Black dictates immediate thermobaric sterilization of the grid square to prevent mimetic spread. Asterisk. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just the soldiers hunting me. It was the information itself. By seeing the thing in the pit, I was already a carrier. The cleanup crew. They weren't immune. I tapped into their tactical frequency again, listening closely. Command, this is Obsidian Leader. Target neutralized in server room B. We are proceeding to set the charges on the structural supports. Copy, Obsidian Leader, a voice from the surface replied. Detonation sequence initiated. T-minus 20 minutes. Hold position for extraction. There was a pause. Then the surface voice spoke again, on a different, encrypted channel I barely caught. Obsidian team is compromised. Visual contact with the artifact confirmed via their helmet cams. Do not extract. Repeat, do not extract. Include Obsidian team in the sterilization radius. The soldiers hunting me were dead men walking and didn't even know it. The government was nuking the pawn to take the king. I stared at the screen. 20 minutes. A thermobaric weapon, a fueler bomb, would incinerate everything down here. Sucking the oxygen out of the tunnels and collapsing the mountain on top of us. There was no fighting that. I checked the facility schematics on the screen. desperate for a route the tactical map missed. The elevators were locked down. The ventilation shafts were being flooded with nerve gas. I could hear the hiss starting in the distance. My eyes darted across the blueprints until they landed on a faint, dotted line running beneath the excavation pit. An old drainage outflow from the original 1950s mining operation. It bypassed the filtration systems and dumped out into a dried riverbed 3 miles west. The problem? To get to the access hatch, I had to go down there. Into the atrium. Right past the artifact. Right through the kill zone where the mutated bodies were piled. And I had to do it while a squad of elite killers, who were about to realize they'd been betrayed, converged on the same location to set their bombs. I checked my gear. 7 rounds in the rifle. A half-empty pistol. 1 flashbang. And a body that was screaming at me to lie down and quit. I tore a strip of cloth from my shirt and blindfolded myself, leaving only a tiny slit at the bottom to see my feet. I couldn't look at the artifact. If the file was right, looking at it was what started the mutation. I had to navigate the atrium by memory and peripheral vision, fighting blind against a tactical team and a reality-warping monolith. Okay, I whispered to the empty room, racking the slide on the pistol. Let's make it messy. I hit the door release. The hydraulic hiss sounded like a starter pistol. I stepped out into the catwalk, the heat from the pit rising to meet me. Below, I could hear the Obsidian team shouting orders. They had spotted me. But then, the hum of the artifact grew louder, a piercing shriek inside my skull. The soldiers stopped shouting. One of them began to laugh, a wet, gurgling sound that didn't belong to a human throat. The mutation was starting. I vaulted over the railing, plummeting toward the darkness below, praying the landing didn't kill me before the nightmare did. The air in Sector 9 didn't taste like air anymore. It tasted like copper, ozone, and the distinct, cloying sweetness of rot that had been accelerated by decades. I was wedged into the crawlspace above the primary server farm, my knees digging into the galvanized steel mesh, watching the world below through the grating. My heartbeat was a frantic drum against my ribs, loud enough, I feared, to betray me to the death squad sweeping the floor. They moved with a fluid, terrifying precision, black-clad figures with no insignias, their faces obscured by polarized ballistic visors. These weren't standard security. This was the cleanup crew. The erasers. And they weren't just here to kill me. They were here to bury the truth under a mountain of silence. Below me, the tactical lights of their rifles cut through the swirling dust like lasers in a smoke machine. I counted 6 of them in this corridor alone. They moved in a standard diamond formation, covering their sectors, checking corners. Professional. Lethal. I gripped the heavy wrench I'd salvaged from the maintenance bay, a pathetic weapon against suppressed carbines, but it was all I had. The silence of the facility was broken only by the rhythmic thud of their boots, and the occasional static burst of encrypted comms. I checked my watch. 2:14 a.m. I had been down here for what felt like a lifetime, but the real timeline was much tighter. The facility's PA system had ceased its automated warnings about containment breaches 20 minutes ago. Now, It was just a low, rhythmic pulsing sound, a deep bass thrum that seemed to vibrate the fillings in my teeth. I needed to reach the central command node. The schematics I'd found in the lab indicated that the only way to lift the lockdown on the surface elevator was through the terminal in the director's office, located just past the server farm. But between me and that office stood a platoon of mercenaries and whatever nightmares they had inadvertently let loose. I shifted my weight, and a screw groaned in the metal beneath me. Below, 3 rifle barrels snapped upward instantly. I froze. The leader signaled a hold. They scanned the ceiling. I pressed my face into the dust, squeezing my eyes shut, praying to a god I hadn't believed in since I entered this godforsaken desert. A laser sight tracked across the grating, inches from my nose. Then, a scream tore through the facility, a sound not human, not animal, but something tearing, wet and guttural, echoing from the adjacent hallway. The soldiers pivoted instantly, their discipline overriding their curiosity about the ceiling noise. They moved out, stacking up on the door to the east wing. I waited 10 seconds, then 20. When the gunfire started, controlled, rhythmic bursts followed by chaotic full-auto panic, I made my move. I kicked out the vent grate, dropped 10 feet to the linoleum floor, and rolled. The impact jarred my shoulder, sending a spike of pain through my arm, but adrenaline washed it away. I sprinted toward the director's office, the sounds of the massacre behind me serving as a grim motivation. The corridor was bathed in the strobing red of emergency lights. Shadows danced and stretched, looking too much like the entities I had seen in the biolabs. I kept my back to the wall, slicing the pie at every corner, mimicking the movements I'd seen in movies, desperate to keep my profile low. The director's office was a glass-walled fishbowl overlooking the main lab. I shattered the lock with the wrench and threw myself inside, jamming a heavy filing cabinet against the door. I scrambled to the terminal. It was still active, the amber CRT monitor glowing with a single, blinking prompt, awaiting input. I typed in the override code I'd memorized from the keycard found on the corpse in Chapter 6. Omega-7 Zeus. Access granted? The screen flooded with cascading text. I navigated to the security protocols, my fingers trembling so hard I kept hitting the wrong keys. Come on, I hissed through gritted teeth. I found the elevator controls. Surface access locked. I hit the override. Error, protocol black initiated. I stared at the screen. Protocol black. The term had been scrawled on the walls, whispered on the audio logs. I queried the definition. The text that scrolled across the screen made my blood run cold. Protocol black, site sterilization via thermobaric purge and seismic collapse. Asset retrieval, negative. Personnel extraction, negative. Containment status, critical. T-10 minutes to detonation. It wasn't a rescue mission. The soldiers outside weren't there to extract anyone. They were there to secure the perimeter while the facility destroyed itself. They were dead men walking and didn't even know it. Or maybe they did. Maybe that was the price of the job. But seismic collapse caught my eye. They weren't just blowing it up. They were collapsing the geological shelf the lab was built into. They were going to bury this place so deep that future civilizations would think it was an anomaly in the crust. I checked the countdown. 8:42 remaining. The elevator was useless. The shaft would be the first thing to collapse. I frantically searched the schematics for a secondary exit. Ventilation? Too small. Drainage? Sealed. Then I saw it. The emergency venting flue. It was a massive exhaust port designed to purge atmospheric toxins from the lower levels in case of a chemical leak. It ran vertically, straight up to the desert surface, bypassing the main complex. But to open it, I had to manually engage the hydraulics in the pressure chamber, 3 levels down. 3 levels closer to the things that were currently eating the cleanup crew. A massive explosion rocked the facility, knocking me off my chair. The glass walls of the office cracked. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The cleanup crew had likely used a frag grenade, or maybe something worse. I scrambled up, grabbing the printed schematic. I had 8 minutes to descend into hell, open a hatch, and climb a 200-foot ladder while the earth swallowed the building. I moved the filing cabinet and cracked the door. The hallway was silent again. The gunfire had stopped. The screaming had stopped. The air was thick with smoke and a metallic tang of blood. I stepped out, the wrench heavy in my hand. I moved toward the stairwell, my footsteps splashing in puddles of viscous fluid that looked black under the red emergency lights. I reached the landing and looked over the railing. The stairwell spiraled down into darkness. I could hear something breathing down there. A wet, rasping sound, like a punctured lung trying to draw air. It was big. I didn't have a choice. I started the descent. Level 8. Clear. Level 9. Clear, but the walls were covered in a strange, bioluminescent mold that pulsed in time with the facility's low thrum. Level 10. The pressure chamber. The door to the chamber was blasted off its hinges. Inside, the industrial hum of the machinery was deafening. I spotted the manual override wheel on the far side of the catwalk. Between me and the wheel stood one of the soldiers. He was facing away from me, swaying slightly. "Hey!" I shouted, desperation overriding caution. "We have to go! The place is rigged to blow!" The soldier turned slowly. My breath hitched. His visor was shattered. Where his face should have been, there was only a smooth, pale surface of writhing flesh. Tendrils extending from his neck into the collar of his tactical vest. He, or it, raised the rifle. I dove behind a generator just as the bullets sparked off the metal. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space. I scrambled on my hands and knees, flanking left while the creature suppressed my last position. I needed to close the distance. I needed to get to that wheel. The facility groaned, a deep, tectonic sound that signaled the beginning of the structural failure. 6,000 characters of narration? No, this was the end of the world in microcosm. I picked up a heavy pipe fitting from the floor, weighed it in my hand, and waited for the reload. Click. I surged forward. The thing in the soldier's armor fumbled with the magazine, its motor skills degraded by the mutation. I didn't hesitate. I swung the wrench with every ounce of fear and rage I possessed, connecting with the helmet. The impact was sickeningly wet. The creature went down, twitching. I didn't look back. I sprinted to the valve wheel. It was rusted, seized by time. I threw my weight against it. Nothing. "Turn, damn you!" I screamed, my muscles tearing. The facility shook violently, knocking me to my knees. The lights flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness save for the bioluminescent mold and the tactical light on the fallen soldier's rifle. In the gloom, I saw the wheel inch forward. I gritted my teeth and pushed again. With a screech of tortured metal, the valve gave way. A hiss of escaping pressure roared through the room, and the massive blast doors above began to groan open, revealing a vertical shaft of concrete leading up to a circle of starry sky. The ladder rungs were slick with condensation. I grabbed the rifle from the dead thing, checked the mag, half full, and slung it over my shoulder. I jumped for the first rung just as the floor beneath me buckled. The structural collapse had begun. I climbed, hand over hand, lungs burning, as the roar of the earth devouring the lab rose up to meet me. Protocol Black was in full effect. And I was the only loose end left to cut. The respirator wheezed, a dying mechanical lung rattling against my ribs with every desperate inhalation. The display on my wrist computer, the HUD I'd scavenged from the corpse in Sector 7, was flashing a crimson critical warning, not for my vitals, but for the structural integrity of the shaft I was currently ascending. Below me, the darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical, rising tide. The facility wasn't just abandoned, it was being digested. I checked the suppressed carbine slung across my chest. 1 magazine left. 28 rounds of tungsten core ammunition that I prayed would be enough to puncture whatever was waiting for me at the surface airlock. The rungs of the maintenance ladder were slick with condensation and that black, viscous oil leaking from the walls, making every meter a gamble against gravity. My Geiger counter, which had been clicking like a manic metronome for the last hour, suddenly fell silent. That terrified me more than the noise. It meant the sensor had burned out. I paused at the landing of Sublevel 2, my boots ringing hollow on the grating. I needed a second to stabilize my heart rate. According to the stolen schematics burned into my retinas, the blast doors to the surface lay 50 meters above, through the main ventilation exchange. But the sounds coming from below were changing. The metallic screeching of tearing steel had stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrumming, a heartbeat the size of a building. This was the source of the anomaly. The engine the logs spoke of. I reached into my webbing and pulled out the hardened drive I'd ripped from the mainframe in the command center. Protocol Black. The file name had seemed innocuous until I decrypted the header during the lockdown in Chapter 8. It wasn't a containment protocol. It was a sterilization algorithm. And I was carrying the trigger. "Move!" I whispered to myself, the voice sounding alien through the bone conduction comms. I pushed upward, muscles burning with lactic acid and adrenaline. The air grew thinner, sharper, tasting of ozone and ancient dust. I reached the ventilation exchange, a massive turbine housing that had been silent for decades. Now, however, the blades were vibrating. The facility was waking up. Not to resume operations, but to execute its final directive. I swung over the railing, weapon raised, scanning the catwalks. The tactical flashlight mounted on my rail cut a harsh cone through the gloom. Shadows danced in the periphery, moving with a fluidity that defied physics. They were the residuals mentioned in the site director's journal, echoes of the dimension they had tried to bridge. I moved into a low crouch, pieing the corner toward the maintenance hatch. Clear. I advanced, heel to toe, keeping my sound profile to 0. Then the facility screamed. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was a psychic shear, a frequency that bypassed the ears and vibrated the teeth in my skull. The HUD static fuzzed, resetting with a new directive, Protocol Black initiated. Perimeter sanitization T-180 seconds. 3 minutes. 3 minutes before the thermobaric charges buried in the foundation turned this entire complex, and the desert above it, into a glass crater. I broke silence, sprinting toward the heavy bulkhead door marked surface access. The stealth approach was dead. I hit the door at full speed, slamming the manual override lever. Rust and hydraulic fluid sprayed as the gears groaned, fighting 50 years of oxidation. The door cracked open, just enough for me to squeeze through. I tumbled into the airlock, a small hexagonal chamber separating the nightmare below from the Nevada night above. But I wasn't alone. Huddled in the corner, illuminated by the strobe of the emergency lighting, was a figure in a torn hazmat suit. The patch on the shoulder read NASA Security. He wasn't moving, but his head turned toward me with a sickening crackle of vertebrae. The visor was opaque, covered in the same black oil. "You shouldn't have taken it." A voice buzzed over the open localized frequency. It wasn't human. It was synthesized, chopped from 1,000 different audio logs. The figure raised a sidearm. I didn't hesitate. Survival instinct overrode curiosity. I double-tapped the trigger. The tungsten rounds punched through the visor, shattering the glass. No blood sprayed out, only a hiss of pressurized gas and black smoke. The suit collapsed empty. It was a suit filled with the anomaly, a hollow puppet designed to stall me. 1 minute, 20 seconds. I scrambled to the outer door. It was sealed with a biometric lock, the panel dead. "Damn it!" I roared, slamming the butt of my rifle against the steel. I looked around the small chamber. There, the manual explosive bolts. A last resort exit. I grabbed the detonation cord, twisting the safety pin free. It required a synchronized pull. I braced my back against the inner door, feeling the heat rising from the facility below. The floor plates were getting hot. The thermobaric reaction had already started in the core. I gripped the handle. 3, 2, 1. I yanked the cord. The explosion was deafening, a concussive slap that threw me across the room. The outer door was blown off its hinges, tumbling out into the sand. I crawled out, coughing, dragging my body onto the cool, coarse sand of the desert floor. The night sky was a sprawling canopy of indifferent stars. I scrambled up, forcing my legs to run, putting distance between me and the ventilation shaft. I didn't look back. I just ran, the cool desert air burning my lungs. I made it perhaps 300 yards before the ground buckled. It wasn't a fireball. Protocol Black was cleaner than that. The earth simply imploded. A dull thump resonated through the soles of my boots, followed by the sound of millions of tons of rock shifting. I turned around. A depression, hundreds of feet wide, had formed where the lab entrance used to be. The sand was rushing in like water, filling the void, burying the secrets, the entities, and the history. Silence returned to the desert. Absolute, ringing silence. I fell to my knees, clutching the hard drive. I had made it. I had the proof. I looked down at the drive in my hand, ready to celebrate the victory. Then my blood ran cold. The drive's casing was glowing with a faint, pulsing violet light, the same light I had seen in the core. The HUD on my wrist beeped one final message, decoding the last file from the drive locally. Text scrolled across the cracked screen. Protocol Black. Containment vector confirmed. Carrier unit outside perimeter. Beginning stage 2 dissemination. I stared at the words. The realization hit me harder than the shockwave. The self-destruct wasn't to kill the entity. It was to force it out. The lab wasn't a prison, it was an incubator. And by escaping, I hadn't survived the protocol. I was the protocol. The drive wasn't data, it was the seed. I looked at my hands. Under the moonlight, the veins in my wrist were darkening, turning that familiar, oily black. The geometry of the desert horizon seemed to shift, angles becoming wrong, distances becoming impossible. I stood up, the only living thing for miles, and felt the hunger wake up inside me. I wasn't the survivor of the NASA laboratory. I was its legacy. And as I began to walk toward the distant lights of the highway, I knew that the true experiment was just beginning.